disappearing doppelgängers, Viking thralls, and the comedy of the sagas. All that and more on this bonus episode of Our Fake History. Roll the bonus theme. Hello, and welcome to this bonus episode of Our Fake History. My name is Sebastian Major, and normally this is the podcast where we explore historical myths and try to determine what's fact, what's fiction, and what is such a good story that it simply must be told. But on these bonus shows, I like to take a little pause from that and respond to questions from my amazing community of listeners. We just wrapped up a trilogy of episodes on the Norse voyages to North America around the early 11th century. Now, as I mentioned in the series, this topic had been on my to-do list for a very long time, and I'm glad we finally got to it because it was a lot of fun. Even I was a little surprised by the depth and breadth of fake Viking history that's been part of the conversation for the last couple hundred years. The ancient Norse are one of those cultures that some folks can get kind of weird about. And so I'm glad over the course of our series, we were able to recognize that weirdness and perhaps trace the root of that weirdness while also celebrating the very real and very impressive feats of exploration that were done by medieval Norse people. I'm also glad that I finally had the opportunity to dive deep into the sagas because, they are fascinating texts. And while they are very challenging to get into, if you hang with them, you can find these incredible stories that are nestled in there. The juice is definitely worth the squeeze when it comes to the Icelandic sagas. Also, they are gems of world literature that we should all understand a little bit better. Now, as always, you folks had some amazing questions about this series that I'm going to do my best to answer today. But I wanted to start today by addressing a comment I saw about the episode art, specifically the art for the first episode in this series. This was one of those comments that lingered with me, but when I went back to find it so I could properly quote it in this episode, I no longer knew where it was. I'm not sure if someone put this on Patreon, if they tweeted it at me or sent it to me on Blue Sky, or if it was on the Facebook group. Wherever you are, if you're listening, get back to me because I'm not sure which one of you actually said this. But one of the listeners out there was annoyed that part one of this series featured episode art that had an image of a stereotypical Viking wearing the historically inaccurate horned helmet. This listener thought that I should have taken the opportunity to present a more historically accurate Norse seafarer to the world. Did this image propagate the very historical myths that I claim to be out here busting? So, longtime listeners know that all the art for this show is created by my friend and longtime collaborator, Frank Fiorentino. Frank has been making art for Our Fake History since season 1, and he's shaped the entire visual aesthetic of what we do here. I absolutely adore what he creates for this show, and I honestly could not do it without him. He was also one of the first people to believe in this project and encouraged me to keep it going. So, Frank's my guy. And one of the many things that makes Frank such an incredible collaborator is the amount of thought and care he puts into each individual piece of art. Frank does a bunch of his own research into these topics before he creates the images for the episodes. We are in constant communication about the topics that I'm going to be covering, the main themes of the episodes, the myths that I'm going to be busting. Only after we've had these conversations does he go out and create. Now, sometimes Frank will create an image that is meant to represent the historical myth that I am busting. The artwork for episode 1 of this series was purposefully exaggerated. Not only does the Viking wear a horned helmet, he kind of looks a lot like Thor from Marvel Comics, right? That was done on purpose. Often in multi-part series, Frank will have one image that is meant to represent the myth, and then the second or third image in the series will be one that is more historically accurate. If you want to see another example of this, go back and look at the art that Frank created for the trilogy we did on Marie Laveau a few seasons back. The image for episode 1 depicts her as the freaky witch of myth. The second image shows her as a more historically accurate healer and medicine woman. If you listened to the episodes, then you would know that, of course, the freaky, witchy image is a depiction of the myth. But I am also aware that these images live on the internet where they can be free from the context of the podcast. And that's the tricky thing. An image that was purposefully exaggerated to depict a historical lie might be latched onto by someone who actually believes that lie. Gah! In an increasingly context-free world, this is something that troubles me. So, is the responsible thing to do then just make art that cannot be taken out of context? I don't know. Maybe. My instinct right now is I've just got to keep letting my man cook. Frank is so good at what he does, and I know that he approaches each image with a lot of thought and care. Hopefully, those of you listening here understand that some of the images are meant to represent the mythical. But, how much do the intentions of the artist even matter, right? This is one of the great debates in the world of art. So, all of this is to say, we're going to be moving forward using the same ethical meter stick that we've always used. Luckily, most of the people who see this art and engage with this art are fans of this podcast. So that means they are getting the context for these images. We are aware that these images have a life outside of this podcast, and we should be conscious of that when we are creating these images. However, I believe that our creative moral compass is pointing in the right direction. I just want you folks to know that Frank and I are discussing this stuff, we care about it, and we're not just throwing images out into the world willy-nilly. Okay. Let's move on to a question from Patreon. This question comes to us from Annalisa. Annalisa writes, "Hi, Sebastian. Did you come across anything in your research that explained why the second Vinland settlement had such a different name from the others? Hope is such an odd name compared to Stromfjord or Vinland." All right. Thanks for the question, Annalisa. This is an easy one to answer. So I think the confusion here comes from the fact that this podcast remains deeply committed to being an audio experience. When you hear the Norse name hope, it sounds like a very conventional English word. However, when you see this word written, its Scandinavian origin becomes very clear. Hope is spelt H-O with the acute accent mark P. Norwegians or Swedes might pronounce this word closer to hope. Hopefully I'm getting that right. I'm sure various Scandinavian accents will do different things to that word. But hope literally translates as tidal lake or tidal lagoon. You might remember that the Saga of Eric the Red tells us that Hope was founded at a place where there were a bunch of long sandbars and tidal lakes or tidal lagoons. And for those that don't know, these are bodies of water located near the coast of the ocean that are affected by the ocean tides. These lakes typically have some sort of shallow connection to the ocean, which allows salt water to flow in and out of them. So, Hope was called Hope because presumably it was near some hopes, or tidal lakes. This is one of the reasons why northeastern New Brunswick is favored as a potential location for southern Vinland, because there are all sorts of tidal features there like lakes, lagoons, long sandbars, and tidal rivers. So this connects to another question that we got from Jim on Patreon. Jim writes, I was wondering if the likeliest spot for the theoretical other North American Viking settlement is New Brunswick or elsewhere in the Maritimes, are there any theories as to why no trace of it has been discovered? These are not exactly remote, unpopulated areas. Could the spot have changed into a swamp or gone underwater for some reason? End quote. Okay, another great question. So there are a few ways to explain the lack of physical evidence for a Viking settlement anywhere south of Newfoundland. The first explanation is exactly what Jim proposes. Since the Norse built their settlements near the seashore, all evidence may have been destroyed by changing sea levels over the centuries. It's entirely possible that anything the Norse built at Hope or any other more southerly spot on the coast went underwater. Another possibility is that the southern Norse settlement may have been occupied, destroyed, disassembled, or otherwise stripped by the indigenous people in that region after the conflict described in the sagas. If there was a real battle around Hope in southern Vinland, then the local people may have destroyed anything that was left there to discourage the Norse from ever returning. After things turned violent, the local people may have not wanted these outsiders to even have a toehold in the country, so they ripped up anything that they built. Then, there's also the very real possibility that the Norse only ever built temporary camps in Hope. As archaeologist Birgitta Wallace has pointed out, Hope was the place that the Norse went to collect resources, and Stromfjord was the more permanent base where everything was processed. The Norse may not have ever built anything that resembled the more substantial buildings that we see at Lanso Meadows. Also, the Lanso Meadows site makes it clear that the Norse were here for a good time, but not a long time. Remember, they only fired up that iron forge at Lanso Meadows one time. They only did one smelt. When they left Lanso Meadows, they took with them everything of value. One of the most striking things about the site is how little was left behind. No one is buried there. No tools or weapons have been found there. The Norse left a slag pile left over from the smelt, some nails that got lost in the grass, one spindle whorl, and a cloak pin. When they went back to Greenland, they took everything with them. It's safe to assume that they did the same in the southern camp at Hope. The Norse packed up and shipped out absolutely everything of value. If this southern camp had always been more temporary in nature and featured less substantial buildings, then it follows that there's no physical evidence of it left. But of course, there's also the chance that the evidence is still out there waiting to be found. Remember, at Lanso Meadows, there were those butternut shells. The Norse had to have collected those butternuts from somewhere further south than northern Newfoundland. Perhaps one day archaeologists will discover some evidence that shows us where the Norse collected those butternuts. Like I said, the butternuts are the key piece of the puzzle here. Today's episode of Our Fake History is being brought to you by Quince. A thoughtfully built wardrobe comes down to pieces that mix well and last. That's where Quince shines. Premium fabrics, considered design, and everyday essentials that feel effortless to wear and dependable, even as the seasons change. Quince works directly with top factories and cuts out the middlemen. You're not paying for brand markups or fancy retail stores. Just quality clothing. I got a chance to cruise through Quince's website, and I got this great lightweight jacket that I absolutely love. I like wearing it. It pairs well with a lot of other stuff I already have, and it didn't break the bank. Quince wants you to stop overcomplicating your wardrobe. You don't need a closet full of options. You just need a few pieces that actually work. Right now, go to quince.com/fakehistory for free shipping and 365-day returns. That's a full year to build your wardrobe and love it. And you will. Now available in Canada, too. Booyah! Don't keep settling for clothes that don't last. Go to quince.com/fakehistory for free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/fakehistory. The next question comes to us from Damien on Patreon. And I just want to give everyone listening a heads up. This question has to do with slavery and sexual assault. As always, this discussion is going to be respectful and not explicit, but if you're not in the headspace to be engaging with those topics, or you're listening with younger listeners, you may want to skip forward about 8 minutes. After hearing the first episode in the Viking trilogy, Damien had this question. He writes, "Hi, Sebastian. First, I really enjoyed this episode. It was great context for what was to come. I have one question so far. When you talked about the settlement of Iceland and Greenland, you mentioned that these places drew people from around the Norse world, including Ireland. I had the impression that the Norse brought slaves with them from Ireland, usually women. This was because the Danes and the Norwegians had a poor impression of Iceland, and so very few women wanted to move there. Dublin was, of course, one of the biggest slave markets in Europe at the time. So a few quid spent there, or a bit of raiding on your own, and then you have the settlers you need. Is this true?" All right, thanks so much for the question, Damien. In the course of this series, I did not get into the issue of slavery in the medieval Norse world. This was not because this is not an important or interesting issue. It's just because that properly reckoning with slavery takes time and care. I had a ton to cover in those episodes, and so I wasn't quite ready to crack open the can of worms that was slavery among the Norse. Now, hopefully it did not come across like I was trying to whitewash this history or imply that the Norse did not have slaves. So I'm glad that I get a chance to speak on this now. Slavery was an integral part of ancient and medieval Norse society. The slaves were known as thralls, and they represented the bottom rung of the highly stratified society in which they lived. This was a laboring underclass that did everything from agricultural work to household labor to really any task that the people who enslaved them wanted them to do. In the early medieval chronicles, one of the things that Christian writers found so upsetting about the still pagan Vikings was that they had no problem enslaving Christians. Now, to be clear, many medieval Christians were fine with pagans or other non-Christians being in bondage, but enslaving co-religionists was seen as particularly sinful. That was a position that noticeably changed when the transatlantic slave trade got into full swing. But in the early medieval period, the pagan Norse were among Europe's most prolific slave traders. Now, some of these thralls were people from the Scandinavian homelands who had been found guilty of crimes. But the vast majority of these enslaved people were folks who had been captured from places where the Norse were known to go a Viking. Many of the thralls came from Eastern Europe in regions along the Volga River. Many others came from England, Scotland, and Ireland. When Iceland was settled in the 800s, thousands of thralls were brought to that country. Genetic studies have since revealed that, as Damien correctly pointed out, the vast majority of the thralls that ended up in Iceland were originally from Ireland. We also know that most of these enslaved Irish people were women. The sagas demonstrate that many of the early settlers in Iceland were men from Norway and other parts of the Norse world who had been dispossessed by war or had been forced out of their homelands for other reasons. Remember, Eric the Red's father was essentially banished to Iceland after he murdered someone. So, originally, Iceland was a frontier society that, like many frontier societies, attracted outlaws and single men. It's clear that Irish women were forcibly brought to Iceland to be these men's sexual partners. That same genetic study that I referenced before has shown that many early Icelanders were half Norse and half Irish, with their Irish genes coming from their mothers. But enslaved people were not the only folks of Irish, Scotch, or Brittonic descent in early Iceland. We also know that free people who had been intermingling with the Norse for over a century also made the journey to Iceland. These were also folks from places like the Hebrides and the Orkney Islands. But there's no denying that slavery is a huge part of this story. Many people were brought to Iceland against their will and were made to do everything from build towns to work farms to carry and raise the next generation of colonists. We also know that there were thralls who were brought to Greenland who were forced to help build that colony as well. Now, does that mean that thralls were also involved in the expeditions to Vinland? The sagas do not mention them specifically, but given what we know about Greenland, it would not be out of the question that enslaved people may have been working at Stromfjord or Lanso Meadows. But because Iceland was isolated and travel to the island became more difficult as the medieval period went on, it became harder and more expensive for Icelanders to import newly enslaved people. As such, the institution of thraldom became far more fragile in Iceland when compared to other spots in the Norse world. Icelandic law changed to reflect this. Iceland was one of the first places in the Norse world that brought in regulations that limited the violence that could be done to an enslaved person. It became a crime to murder a thrall. Medieval Icelanders also created laws that specifically protected enslaved people from sexual violence. Now, this is not to say that Icelandic slavery wasn't so bad after all, because let's be clear, any form of bondage is brutal and dehumanizing. But the small population in Iceland meant that the wanton abuse of this underclass needed to be restrained. At a certain point, the thralls became rare in Iceland, which helped them gain some basic human rights. Or at the very least, more rights than they had in other parts of the Norse world. By the late 1100s, changing values influenced by Christianity led to the slow decline in thraldom across the Norse world. So, right around the time the Vinland sagas were being written down in the 12th century, slavery had almost completely disappeared in Iceland. Thanks again for that question, Damien, because that's an important part of the story that we just did not address in the main series. The next question comes to us from Jay on Patreon. Now, before we jump into this one, I feel like I should give you some context. Jay's question has to do with that very strange scene in the Saga of the Greenlanders that takes place right before violence breaks out between the Norse and the Skrælings in Vinland. This is when the Norse matriarch Gudrid has a strange encounter with a large-eyed woman who says that her name is also Gudrid. All right, here's what Jay writes. I have some questions about the big-eyed lady Gudrid supposedly met. It doesn't make sense to me that the text emphasizes her pale skin and huge eyes, even saying they're, quote, bigger than any others in the world. But those descriptors don't seem to apply to Gudrid. Not to mention that if this woman did look like Gudrid, I would think that would be the first thing that Gudrid noticed. But there seems to be no indication that they resembled one another. How could this figure be a doppelganger if she didn't actually look like Gudrid? Relatedly, this also makes me wonder how their conversation was actually phrased. Like Gudrid says, "Hi, my name is Gudrid, what's yours?" And then, did the big-eyed lady actually say, "My name is Gudrid," or did she just say, "Gudrid," like she was perhaps testing the name out, and Gudrid just thought she was saying her name was Gudrid too? There probably isn't a good answer for that last question, but I did wonder about it. Okay, thanks so much for the question, Jay. Now, I think part of the issue here is Jay is working with a more limited understanding of what a doppelganger is. In that episode, you heard me say that some experts believe that encounter with the strange big-eyed lady was a doppelganger encounter or was influenced by Norse and Germanic doppelganger mythology. Now, Jay, I'm sure like many of you listening, heard that term doppelganger and assumed that a doppelganger is someone's perfect double. That's how we've come to think of doppelgangers and how we use the term colloquially in English. But ancient and medieval doppelganger mythology can be a bit more messy. Doppelgangers are sometimes presented as a person's exact double, but a doppelganger can also be a type of spectral projection or a spirit being that takes on aspects of another person, but isn't quite their exact double. The doppelganger can also be a dark mirror that reflects something specific about a person's spiritual essence. Then there are all sorts of doppelganger-adjacent spirits and creatures that appear in Norse and Germanic mythology that don't always have names. To be clear, the saga never uses the word doppelganger to describe the big-eyed woman who met with Gudrid in Vinland. The reason that some experts think this story was doppelganger-adjacent is because the woman says mysteriously, "My name is Gudrid." However, this is not the only interpretation. In fact, Jay, you managed to puzzle out one of the other main interpretations of this moment. One of the experts that I referenced a ton in this series was Annette Kolodny, and she proposes that that scene could have reflected a real meeting between Gudrid and an indigenous woman who had traveled to the Norse camp with the group of local traders described earlier in the saga. Aside from having weirdly exaggerated eyes, the woman is also described as having dark brown hair, which may be a hint that she was a real Algonquin-speaking person. The Norse also did not see much of a difference between their own skin color and the skin color of the people they called Skraelings. In fact, many of the first Europeans to visit North America described indigenous North Americans as light-skinned. This is just another example of how ideas of race were constructed over time, but that's another can of worms. The point is that it was not out of the ordinary for an indigenous person to be described as pale, even in later centuries. So, to go back to your question about the specifics of their exchange, the saga tells us that Gudrid said, quote, "My name is Gudrid, what is yours?" And the woman replied, quote, "My name is Gudrid," end quote. Now, Jay guessed that the visitor may have been trying out Gudrid's name. Annette Kolodny has suggested something similar. The fact that this woman repeats Gudrid's words exactly may have been an attempt at communication. Gudrid says something that this woman does not understand, so she just repeats it back phonetically. This is often how attempts to communicate over a language barrier get started. One person says something in their language, the other person tries to repeat it, even if they don't entirely understand it. It's a show of goodwill that kind of crosses cultures. So, this woman may have been a real person who wandered into Gudrid's house and tried to communicate with her. The giant eyes and the fact that she then vanishes into thin air are harder to explain. It could be that this was a real event filtered through doppelganger mythology. Like I said in the series, the sagas often feel like history told through the lens of a dream. And this encounter definitely has that surreal, dreamlike quality. Oh, there was this woman, and I recognized her, but also I didn't recognize her, and her eyes were huge. And then I said my name, and then she said that she had the same name, and then she disappeared. Sounds like you're describing a dream, right? But like so many things in the sagas, that doesn't mean that it didn't happen. This brings me to our final question for today, which comes to us from Chandra, also on Patreon. It was all patrons on today's episode. You know I'm looking at that Patreon chat first and foremost, so if you want to get your questions to the front of the queue, think about becoming a patron. All right, Chandra writes, I took a course in college specifically about the Viking sagas and family stories. It was an amazing course, and it really talked about how the stories are about the family history more than anything else. One thing I really noticed that I commented on at the time is that the sagas are funny. There are a lot of weird parts that only make sense as absurdist humor. There's a part in, I think it was Nigel's saga, where they encounter a monopod, a monster with one foot and its face in the middle of its torso. One of the guys makes fun of it, so the monopod throws a stick at him and kills him. It's so random but funny. So I think keeping that in mind when reading them really helps. We think of the sagas as these super important and super serious texts, but they really weren't. They were meant to be entertaining as much as anything else. Chandra, I love this point. Yes, we should not forget that the sagas were a form of entertainment. In fact, for a while, they were one of the only forms of entertainment that were sanctioned by the Icelandic Church. So they kind of had to be everything. Family genealogies, adventure stories, and comedies. I like the idea that the weird moments in the sagas are kind of like the oral storytelling equivalent of the rude marginalia that you find in illuminated medieval manuscripts. In those texts, you could be reading a serious account of a certain king's reign, and then you look in the margins and there's a cartoon of a weird creature and a guy playing the trumpet with his butt. We should never forget that human beings are goofy, and people in the past were just as silly as we are today. Their humor just existed in a different cultural context. There's an impulse out there to turn the past into something humorless. Our ancestors, both real and imagined, are sometimes turned into these towering, flawless superheroes who seriously went about doing great deeds. There are some who especially like presenting the ancient Norse in this way. They become these glowering Nordic gods. This is a two-dimensional, cardboard version of our past. It's not only inaccurate, it's boring. And it's also associated with some very dark totalitarian ideologies. The human experience is weird and diverse and tragic and silly and funny and intense and brutal. It is my greatest delight, especially when I'm researching the ancient or medieval period, and something recognizably human makes its way into the sources. I love finding out that an ancient person had a sense of humor. So, yes, Chandra, I'm with you. Let's not forget that sometimes people are silly beans, and even the sagas can get goofy on purpose. Okay, I think we should call it there. I want to end on that upbeat note. Thank you again to everyone that sent in their questions. Big ups to everyone on Patreon. Hey, if you want to get in on Patreon, go to patreon.com/ourfakehistory. It's the best way to support this show. The Patreon community is what keeps this podcast going. And if you've got questions about the show, I always look at the Patreon chat first. So these bonus episodes are really fueled by the patrons. But of course, there are many different ways that you can get in touch with me. You can always send me an email at ourfakehistory@gmail.com. You can find me on Facebook, facebook.com/ourfakehistory. You can find me on Instagram at ourfakehistory. I'm out there making little tiny videos on TikTok now at ourfakehistory. I'm on YouTube at ourfakehistory. I'm everywhere on Our Fake History. So look for me and you shall find me. As always, the theme music for our show comes to us from Dirty Church. Check out more from Dirty Church at dirtychurch.bandcamp.com. All the other music you heard on the show today was written and recorded by me. My name is Sebastian Major, and remember, just because it didn't happen doesn't mean it isn't real.
TV has thousands of free movies and TV shows.
I swear.
If I'm lying, I'm dying.
This is the mindset.
Free.
This is the mantra.
Free.
This is the mindset.
With movies like Interstellar, Dreamgirls, and Gladiator.
Are you not entertained?
And TV shows like Survivor, SpongeBob SquarePants, The Fairly Odd Parents, and Ghosts. Pluto TV is always free. Huzzah! Pluto TV. Stream now, pay never.